Hey, I'm Cadence. I'm in fourth year kinesiology. You're listening to 94.9 CHRW.
You're listening to the Forum on CHRW. This project is designed to be a safe space for students to ask the hard questions. It is for students, by students, and instead of being a place for lecturers and academics, it's for the average student to ask a question and say what's on their mind without fear. Before we continue the discussion on racism at Western, I want to talk about an event I witnessed over the weekend. I was taking my son to play in the park by where we lived. There were two little girls who were singing a song, and on its face it was blatantly racist, particularly towards Asians. I talked to my wife and I said that I would like to keep my son from playing with them if possible because of what they were singing. She agreed, but then reminded me that the song had been around since we were that age. My son continued to play with another boy and keep us busy with his complete disregard for the laws of gravity, so it kind of went out of my mind at the time. Now, let me say, I don't blame the two girls, not directly. There's no 6-year-old who really understands what racism is, particularly when it's in a song. I also pray that they never actually experience what racism is like. But I do blame the adults in their lives. I blame their parents for not teaching them about tolerance, or at least hearing the song and speaking up against it. I blame the teachers in their lives for not correcting it on the schoolyard, which is, I'm sure, where they learned it from. And I also blame myself. There's a line when it comes to other people's children. There are things you can do and things you can't, and sometimes it's hard to come near that line. But I could have asked them how the two older Asian girls who were playing basketball near them would have felt if they had have heard it, or how they would have felt if the song had have been about Indians. I should have said, I tell you this story to show you how easy it is to do nothing. There's always an excuse, a reason not to do something. If you see your friends doing something wrong, it's hard to speak up. I just hope that next time I'm able to. Now I'm going to bring Bianca and Greg back into the conversation. We're continuing to talk about racism at Western, which I feel is a very important conversation. It's the start to so many other things. It's what leads to things like cultural appropriation, trigger warnings, and maybe not so much trigger warnings, but microaggressions and things like that. So, it's always the hardest conversation. And I really want to thank you guys for literally being brave enough to step up to the mic about it, because it's not easy. We're going to come back to what we're talking about just before the break, which was how to talk to your friends about it. And I think, being able to point out to them and be comfortable enough with the people around you to say, like, hey, this isn't okay. But then we start talking about education, which I think is really important. Have you guys had any luck talking to your friends? I mean, so Greg, with your story about the guys in residence, maybe not so lucky. But Bianca, I'm going to come to you first about your friend.
Okay.
Or any other situations you've had. Did you have any luck with him?
I personally don't think that he has changed his mind. But I think that if it does come up again, I probably will take a more stronger stance and just ask him a few questions again, because I don't know, it becomes very difficult. And also I have this same experience with my parents, which is awful because they're the people who raised me and they're wonderful in every way, except they still express certain opinions about races. And I think it does come with talking to them. That's the first thing. But as far as success goes, I think it is just open conversation and not being.
No.
Okay.
That was that. Sorry. Once again on radio, and I was trying to be subtle about it. Bianca actually brought up something else that I kind of want to talk about, and I was like, oh, hey, that's a great idea. Just give me a second. I want you to finish. I want you to keep going. So how? No, we'll come back to that in a minute.
That's okay.
So did you have anything else, just with your friends or your friends on campus?
My friends on campus? No, nothing else, honestly. I've been quite lucky. It hasn't been like, all out open.
And I think that circles around it. I think Western sort of does have this perceived image of racism because of certain things that happen to certain professors. who I'm not going to mention, but you can certainly Google really easily. And, you know, like certain things you hear about, like some people think that Western's like 90% white girls at Starbucks.
Oh, yeah.
Which it isn't. I actually think the last statistic is actually about 55% white. So that's actually pretty decent.
Yeah.
That's good.
I would not have guessed that at all.
No. It depends what day you're sitting out on the concrete beach, to be perfectly honest. So, Greg, with your friends or the guys at residence, have you had any luck in conversations?
With those particular group of people in first year, no.
I actually kind of want to know how far off the deep end you flew at them. I'm quite curious.
Keeping in mind that I was 18 at the time, so I'm probably not the most mature I've ever been in my life. Pretty far off.
Okay. And
it was a rough time.
Did you have any success at that?
No, I realistically didn't at all. Because in residence, you have, of course, your residence advisors and your resident staff, I guess, and your softs and what have you. So they were there to kind of mitigate, and obviously they kind of saw my side in that racism is bad and being anti-racist is good. But it became, at that point, more of a mitigation between me being really, really angry and the other people getting angry at me being angry. And so it became more about the nature of the conversation / intense fight that we were having and less about the actual topic that we were fighting about. So I kind of learned how to approach it a little bit better there. But in terms of actually finding resolution to the topic that we were discussing, there was kind of nothing. Okay. But at the same time, being a soft for so many years after that, I kind of got a little bit better at being able to bring out these topics without really getting people super angry at me. So that at least became a learning experience that I could kind of use a little bit more positively later on in life.
Good. That's actually a really good thing. And I think because conversation and education is sort of the key to this. At the other side, we live in a much more technological world. Everybody's interconnected. Everybody's on Facebook. Everybody's on forums where the conversation isn't always civil. And I think when we start yelling at each other and screaming at each other, even behind a keyboard, everybody just tunes out.
Yeah. And
there's no conversation anymore. It's just whichever side wants to be right is going to shout the loudest. And I think, you know, so I'm going to sort of circle to a different question for a second, but it's related. And it has to do with, I think, institutional racism and how it's accepted in certain cultures. So to bring up Greg's sort of point, people at residence, I want to call them your friends, but you keep shaking your head when I say it. So no, in that it really does depend on maybe what kind of music they listen to as to whether or not that word is acceptable and used frequently.
Yeah. That
you start thinking maybe it's okay to use that word. It depends what culture you come from, as opposed, you know, with Bianca's friend, she says friend, so at least I'll get to say it in that instance, as opposed to the guy I know. You know, where you come from, how you're brought up, how you're raised really does affect it. And everybody in this room seems to be very anti-racism, but certainly I know I've come from a family, not my parents, but my grandparents were really, really racist. And Bianca, you mentioned that your parents are. Yeah. And the music that we listen to, that sort of stuff really does affect where we come from and how we view it. So do you guys have any thoughts on that regard, since I just dropped it on you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not going to disagree. Just popular culture and media and all that sort of thing always has an influence, but it's just interesting because I haven't really looked back to see the extent to which kind of racism or racial issues are addressed in mass media. You know, obviously we have things like the Oscars So White for this year. That's a whole
2 years running.
2 years running, yeah. That's a whole controversy, and kind of more controversial issues are coming up that we can kind of look into. But how much people really buy into those and how much people really use those as influence is always hard to say, just because the pervasiveness of media and the amount of influence that people allow into their lives versus just how they form their own opinions with their own separate culture and their friend groups and what have you is always just an interesting thing to try and balance out. And I think it's really difficult to prescribe that to another person and not kind of just figure it out, I guess, kind of a little bit more personally.
Yeah. I think it.
Let's go to the media student
Oh, sure.
to talk about this for a second.
Yeah, I think it becomes really interesting when people like Mindy Calling on the Mindy Project, I think his name, forgive me if I'm getting Aziz Ansari, who does Master of None, Blackish, Fresh Off the Boat, all these shows that kind of make fun and poke at all these stereotypes that our culture comes up with. It's interesting because you're kind of you're giving minorities power to address the stereotypes that are inflicted upon them, but also and take control and put it in their perspective. And I think because we see it in this comedic light that, oh yes, he's brown, but he's making brown jokes, it's okay because he knows that it's a joke and we don't mean it. So I feel like sometimes that may come across some like to the audiences as like it being okay, but I think it adds a different like factor in the mix that we have minorities taking getting in the driver's seat and kind of addressing the stereotypes firsthand. I don't know, how do you guys think that affects our ideas of racism?
Well, what I think is maybe a little different with those ones is that they're using actual personal experiences and personal anecdotes, and that becomes more of a conversation about kind of how their race has influenced their lives and kind of what role that has played. And I don't hesitate to really look down on that, just because if a part of understanding and the education around racism is understanding its offense and its power to hurt people versus just talking about race and just talking about your own identity. So I think that being able to kind of joke around about growing up in an Indian or Chinese or African American household or what have you is not necessarily a bad thing, just because it can give that perspective and that understanding of your own racial identity and kind of how that has shaped you versus actually just looking down upon it. So I think that kind of the colloquialisms or the bit of comedy around these things isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just understanding kind of the difference between where the line is that can be crossed and kind of where just discussions about differences between races are. Granted, that line seems to always be moving, so it's difficult, but
yeah, and it's a really, really hard subject to sort of gauge because people take offense at different levels. We all have personal experiences that gauge us. Somebody from Missouri. Let's talk about Missouri again. It seems to be a favorite of mine. Might be a little bit more sensitive to racism than, say, somebody from Toronto, because it's a different environment. Toronto is incredibly multicultural, and while racism does exist there, it's not as widespread or prevalent as, say, the deep south of the United States, where lynchings still are a thing, apparently. Or even in this instance, Canada versus the U.S., where what we consider racism, what we deal with, and what happens even literally across the border in places like Detroit are very different experiences. So when you try and bring up the conversation, what might be okay to talk about one day with somebody might be completely not okay the next day with somebody else. But in the media, again, this is a whole topic that we could talk about for years and never get to the bottom of. But certain things, and I guess the easiest one, and it relates back to what we were talking about, the N-word. I'm not even 100% sure it's okay for anybody to use, but particularly anybody outside of the hip-hop industry or culture, it's really not okay to use. So if you're not a rapper, then perhaps if you're about to use that word, you should think very hard about use it. And and again, this is my own personal opinion, but I don't care what your color is. If you're about to drop that word, think very hard about it, because that word has a whole history of hate behind it. So, you know, but another one that I've only recently come into that you brought up about a comedian, but you know, again, my really good friend Alan is a first generation Chinese, well, he's not an immigrant, his parents are, is fresh off the boat. And you know how, and the connotation of those words and how it affects a certain group of people. What do you guys think? Because this will circle back to something at Western really quickly.
Seeing the show, I think a lot of the comedy makes sense, and again, I do know that it's a lot of personal anecdote. The actual titling of the show, though, is less than ideal, and I understand the point of what I completely forget the name of the main guy who produces it or whatever it is, but I understand the point of him titling that to kind of just underscore his experience as kind of the sons of I think Chinese immigrants. But again, it just doesn't, it has such a negative connotation and is really not helpful for the idea of immigration, which is so big in both Canada and the US, and it's kind of the struggles that they face and kind of how hard it can be. So it's, yeah, I lost my words there, but
no, I think you got to the point pretty quickly, which is good because I don't.
No, I agree, and I mean, my family, I'm half Asian descent, so I haven't had the chance to actually watch Fresh Off the Boat, but I know my siblings have, and my parents, and they love it because even though, of course, you know, the whole phrase and term fresh off the boat or fob is thrown around and everything, it kind of, again, like how I've said again, that it kind of brings a lighthearted tone to topics that are kind of more harsh. I don't think that it's right. It goes back to what you were saying about the N-word. There was a interview, I didn't get a chance to watch it, I don't know if you guys have, it's between, like, I think Kanye West or Jay-Z with Oprah, and how she's asking them, like, why do you drop the N-word? Why is it okay? I think it'd be something interesting to watch, but from what I believe, I don't know, I feel like it's maybe a weird way of showing them, like, empowerment almost, that they're taking control. They acknowledge their history and their past.
There is the concept of taking back the word, taking it back for themselves for personal use. As I said, the whole N-word debate is an entire debate that we could get into for years. I don't really talk about sort of my own personal stories with stuff like this a lot because I want it to be about everybody else. But talking about stuff like that just brought up one that actually happened, and I guess I glossed it over. So at O Week, one of the highlights of O Week is One Love. And I absolutely loved One Love. It was a very powerful experience, I think is the easiest way to describe it. And I know you were there. Did you go to A Week, Bianca?
Yes, I was there for the most part. Yeah. Okay.
Right at the end was Lieutenant Dan. And I thought Lieutenant Dan was absolutely fantastic. So personal history, I grew up in a very, very multicultural area. One of my best friends growing up was Japanese. I had Korean friends. I had Indian friends. I had a lot of Indian friends, actually. Native American friends, the whole deal. I grew up in a really cultural, and I was very fortunate for it. So Lieutenant Dan comes out and he starts talking about the traditional Korean mother and sort of his experiences with his mother trying to find him a wife and not a white wife. And he brought up at one point the Asian F and all of these things, and I'm laughing because I grew up watching it with my friends. I copied off of my really good friend for one of his math tests right as I was just about to drop math forever, thank God. And I got a B+ on the assignment, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. He got an A-, and his mother was furious. So I'm laughing at this. I'm laughing at Lieutenant Dan because it's relating to my personal history. And somebody walking by who was Asian goes, "Well, why are you laughing?" And my response was, because it's funny. And they went off in a little bit of a huff, and I sort of glossed it over, but I looking back on it, it's like I think they may have actually legitimately been offended that I was laughing at that situation, and I don't know how you deal with that.
I can't obviously speak strongly from personal experience, except I know, especially from my grandfather, who is Taiwanese, that he takes a very serious take to academics and success, and how it is a symbol of, again, success and pride, and it's something that shouldn't be like if you don't get an answer right. I remember him overtly getting very upset at me that it somehow was, a weakness to my character, which I know some people are, would be very sympathetic towards, but that's just a part of some of cultural ideals. And so I feel like maybe that's why the person might have been offended, because you think that it's, and maybe on their perspective thought that it was something that was to joke about, which in that context, yes, it was fair enough to do that. But I think on their side, they may have, probably from personal experience, not have seen that as something to joke about.
Well, and to an extent, I sort of understand where they're coming from. I mean, the old white guy sitting there laughing about, the Asian F and stuff like that. But it may be, again, there's certain times to be offended, and maybe certain times to maybe look at the situation itself and have some thought. So, Western is kind of lucky in that we have a lot of exchange students, a lot, particularly in BMOS. But in a bunch of other programs, we have a lot of exchange students, a lot of internationals. And I kind of wonder how they come into this, because where you're coming from and coming into Canada, into the university system, is a very different proposition to somebody who's lived here, even a first-gener like myself or my friend Ellen, because you guys aren't first-geners, I believe. No? They're shaking their heads. No. What would you say to that, and how racism affects? Have you thought about how racism affects sort of that particular group? And I think, maybe for that question I should be bringing in some international students. But just some thoughts. I know, so.
In my experience, they kind of just do their own thing. I mean, Western's very good about kind of taking care of them and making sure that they are addressed as an independent group almost of everybody else for international and exchange students. I think there's a whole half of a building dedicated to them. So on an institution level, that's there. But I find that just because a lot of the time the cultures are so different, they do kind of not separate themselves, but they kind of form their own kind of pocket groups. And so that, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it in a way, it kind of shields them from the culture shocks and the potential microaggressions or what have you that could have come up otherwise, just because there is a large enough group of them that they kind of get on with people from their own countries more so than they do with people who are actually from here, which is what it is. But at the same time, if we could actually integrate them more and kind of have those conversations a little bit more openly, then it would probably help with understanding kind of racism and where other people are coming from, I guess. Yeah.
I think that's sort of my thought on it is it would be very interesting for the world to see, or I guess Western students to see how racism or race is perceived around the world. And we're very lucky in that we do get them. So maybe that'll be a topic for another show. I'll work on that. So we got a little bit of time left. Yeah, I didn't go over and I didn't over talk about anything. One of the last subjects I wanted to talk about, as I bring up my notes and look at them, because I have a whole bunch of things on the go. And I guess this brings another personal story for me, which I hate divulging personal stuff. I've talked about my best friend Alan a couple of times on the show, and I've known him for a number of years now, and we get along really, really well. But maybe sometimes some of the stuff we talk about between each other maybe isn't the most appropriate. He was around when my son was born, and one of the comments he made was, "Don't worry, you all look the same anyway." And my response to him was, don't worry, we can drive. He's a first generation Japanese, and he fully admits his parents can't drive in any way, shape, or form. But to any sort of outsider, and I'm sure there's people listening to this going, oh, really? You're going to say that on radio? And to have an open conversation, you have to be open. And were we wrong for saying that stuff? I'm not sure. In our own personal little group, and if it was private, maybe not, but we were known to say this while walking down Queen Street, which, is, maybe not the best forum for saying stuff like that. So, and getting back to how quick it is to be offended, what do you guys think? Where is the threshold?
I mean, yeah, in the privacy of your own home, it's with somebody that you're comfortable with and friends with and have the understanding with, that you're, obviously comfortable making light of certain parts of yourself, then that's totally, that's totally fine. It's an intimate enough relationship that you can understand where each other's coming from, and kind of talking about those differences is definitely not a bad thing. Doing that out in the open where people can hear becomes almost a matter of how entitled other people are to listen in on conversations that don't involve them, that are just happening open in the public. If people are getting that offended by two random strangers walking by who are saying some off-color comments to each other, I don't know that they necessarily have a case to make in that they're being super targeted or are really offended, because they don't really have entitlement to, I guess, have strong opinions about things that they're eavesdropping on, so to speak. So while I'm not excusing people who are talking about, hating all of one race that are out and about, and then having somebody of that race over here that and be super concerned, there's definitely a give and take with how entitled you are to actually get offended over things that have nothing to do with you and shouldn't really affect you because you're tangential to it and just hear it kind of really casually, especially in scenarios where it's between two kind of good friends who know each other well enough to make those comments.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying, that if we're in a room and there's nobody and we're, I don't know, making some jokes that may be offensive to others, but people of that race are not in the room, is it okay? Mm-hmm. And again, like yeah. I said it's not. It definitely becomes difficult when you go into the public with that. So your question again was whether or not it's okay for people to overly just judge. I think that people do have a right, if it's personally inflicting them. Like, obviously this goes back to how are we supposed to foster great discussions in ways that are not, going to go off on tangents and outbursts. So I think it goes back to that if you do feel that personally inflicted by something that somebody is saying, I feel that somebody does have the right to kind of be like, hey. But I think that, again, this goes with even back to your story of during O Week of that person who was personally offended. I think everybody needs to take into account a certain context. This is a difficult question, because then it goes back to saying, like, is it okay to even joke about it at all? But yeah. Well,
let me throw it in a different context, okay, really, really quickly. What if it wasn't me and my best friend Alan, who is very obviously Asian?
Yeah.
But what if it was two? I don't want to pick on the white guys because they're an easy. We're an easy subject. I'm an easy target. I'm not gonna lie, for racism, because there's a history there. But okay, we'll do it anyway. What if it's two white guys saying, oh my God, that Chinese driver can't drive, while they're walking down the middle of Queen Street?
See, that you can a little bit more take offense to, because it's more just two people of the same kind of grouping targeting another grouping.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what can you really do about that? If you're out in the street, out in the world, whom are you going to complain to? What can you really do other than to kind of learn how to deal with that when it affects you personally, with people who are personally affecting you, or kind of an institution that you're involved with, or to kind of learn to brush it off and kind of take it at face value as strangers whom you will never see again, going on their way saying some inappropriate things.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree with what you said. I feel like, I don't know, when you described it like that in that context, I imagine myself on Queen Street, maybe sitting down at a coffee shop and overhearing conversations. I wouldn't realistically, I wouldn't like go interfere, but I would take it into account and when experiencing any of those conversations within my personal friend group, my personal social group, or within family, or just in any other situation that I may come across as more like a learning situation. But yeah.
So let's take it one step further, because I really enjoy doing that. What if you've just walked into class and 2 rows behind where you're sitting, you hear those words? Because now we're going to bring it right to Western students, and right to even more personal.
The same.
Well, yeah.
Okay,
well,
anything.
Two white guys sitting back there making a
Okay.
racist comment, or 2 white girls, or 2 black girls, or 2 Asian girls, or 2 Asian guys, or 2 black guys because I've missed them while we're going through.
That's one of those things too, where the university that we attend actually affords us the luxury of having a governing body to kind of look out for us in such a way. Again, there's a zero tolerance policy at Western, and if you actually want to go and talk to them about it and actually feel the need to stand up against it because their comment was so kind of offensive, then you do have the backing of the school, and you do have kind of a justified protection against speaking out against it. And that's something that you kind of lack in the real, quote unquote, real world again. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I think really is helpful for us in a university, not because it shelters us, but it affords us the opportunity of standing up for what's right and standing up against racism in a controlled environment that'll actually foster some change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree completely with what you said, but I do, because I think especially when you're in an environment where you're supposed to feel safe, you're supposed to feel welcome, and you hear those comments, and if it does personally inflict you, or if it inflicts somebody if you have a friend who might be offended, I feel that it is in your freedom and your right to say calmly and rationally, hey, I don't think that's cool, just as if I did with my friend. Even if it was a stranger who I didn't know, I feel that I should say something, that if we don't speak up, it's just going to continue in a vicious cycle.
And I think that's sort of the biggest thing about this. Yes, Greg, you can report them, which might, depending on the situation, be the right thing. Personally, if there's any threat of violence, any threat of actual action, that is an instantly reportable issue. However, if it's not that severe, and again, this is all personal judgment, which is sort of the hardest part. University also affords you the opportunity to be able to sit there and talk to them and say, hey guys, I just heard you. I'm maybe not okay with this. Maybe this isn't the right place to do it. Or if you're brave enough, actually start broaching the subject with them. It's a hard one, I'm not going to lie, but it's the thought. So we're just about out of time today. And I do sort of want to wrap up things with a little bit of a conversation, in that there are no definitive answers about this. There's no definitive answers about racism, though I don't know if there ever will be. And it's the hardest part to end a show after some really, really good conversation and go, well, did we accomplish anything? The biggest thing we accomplished was we actually started to talk about it. And the more we talk about it, the more others will talk about it. And that's how change happens. So I really want to thank you guys for coming here. Do you have any sort of final thoughts about, quickly, like 30-second thoughts on racism at Western?
I think that it's key to acknowledge that it is there, that we shouldn't be ignorant, and we shouldn't also be ignorant in thinking that it's okay, that just because it is there, that it's not something we can't change. I think it comes with increasing awareness and also discussion among friends and family, and also students and teachers. That it, again, like how we 3 here are sitting here today, I think it just comes with having an open conversation about it and being rational and sympathetic towards other people's views and opinions.
For me, my main thing is just to kind of make sure to pick your battles. Obviously, all sorts of racism is bad, but if you're gonna absolutely freak out and blame people who are kind of making more or less innocent, ignorant mistakes about racism and kind of really berate them for it, I think that's not the way that they're going to change, because there's no meaning behind it. They're making honest mistakes, and if you blame them as the sole problem for institutional racism, it's not going to do anything. Whereas if you actually find instances of really bad, severe racism, then that's more what you want to kind of fight against without really ostracizing the people that could help you and just are not well informed.
I don't think I could have put anything better than those two comments. Thank you so much for listening to the forum. I'm David Seston. See you next time.